I am Carolyn Rollins. I was born Carolyn Wade in New Albany, Mississippi, and on August 24th, 1949. I was born at Union County Hospital. At that time, the hospital was segregated. There was a colored wing and a white wing. And so I was born in the colored wing. I know that as a child, my doctor was Dr. Bostwick. And we had lots of contact because I was a sickly child. We didn't know it at the time, but I always had colds or the flu, or I had tonsillitis and my throat would be swollen, almost closed. And I was always being treated for the flu. I grew up on penicillin and chicken and dumplings, sometimes with mashed potatoes, because I had trouble swallowing because of my tonsils. As an adult in my mid-30s, I was diagnosed with asthma. And so the reason that I kept getting the penicillin shots for the cold was because it wasn't a cold, it was asthma. It was aggravated by allergies. And so I would take the penicillin, seem to be doing better, go outside, and I'm sick again. So it was very cyclical. I have intrinsic asthma. My mother had asthma as a child. She grew out of it. Apparently, her symptoms were much clearer because it wasn't until after we had diagnosed the asthma and I was really sick that I learned what a wheeze was, but I never wheezed before then. My parents were Geneva Waldrop Wade and Hannah Wade. Both were longtime Union County residents, born there, families from there. I don't know if they knew each other at a young age because my mother had a prior marriage. She was married to Leland Smith and he died. She had two children from that marriage, my older brother and sister, who were quite a lot older than my younger brother and me. My older brother, Malcolm Smith, my sister, Shirley Smith, were 17 and 15 years older than I am. With my father, there were two children, my younger brother, Hannes Jr., and myself. And I am the remaining member of my family. I was actually the older of the latter two children. My older brother lived in Memphis. He went to the military. He went to school at Jackson State. He went to the military. When he came back, he worked at the Army Depot in Memphis. And so he and his family resided there. My younger brother went to the military, came back to New Albany, married, got involved in some trouble, and died in prison. I have a very interesting family. My maternal grandmother was married and divorced twice before the 1950s. So she had a home in Myrtle. My maternal grandfather lived with us in Myrtle. And my paternal grandparents lived in Myrtle as well. They lived on a farm outside of Myrtle. And we had a home on that farm. During the school year when I was young, we also had a house in New Albany that we rented because my mother taught in New Albany at that time. But before I was born, at least before I can remember, she also taught at schools in Union County at various locations. My grandmother on my father's side taught in Ripley, Tipper and Union County schools, and probably some of the other surrounding counties as well. And one of my earliest memories is being able to go to school with her And at that time, I might have been about 3. And she taught in a one-room schoolhouse way, way up in the woods in Tippah County. And that's all I can tell you. I couldn't go back there. I can't tell you where it was. But I remember because going to school with her was always a pleasure. I got to sit and I got to do what all the older kids did. And so I don't remember a time when I was not able to read. I was sick a lot, so I was home. We had a library in our house, and so I had books surrounding me so that I had something to do while I was lying in bed. My maternal grandmother was a housekeeper for a doctor in Myrtle, Dr. Liddell. When I started school, we lived on Church Street in New Albany. The house is no longer standing. It's been gone for a number of years. And I'm trying to remember we were right at the intersection, and I'm trying to remember the name of the street that intersected with Church. I don't remember it now. On Church Street, we lived there until I was maybe 7, maybe the end of 2nd grade. And so I remember lots of children playing. And I know that the Spears family was down the hill. The Booz family was across the street. And Miss Nora Nesbitt was on the other side at the extreme end of the block. It was, and I can't remember the neighbor's name that was across the street, but it was an older woman. And so whenever we needed anything, if our parents weren't home, she kept an eye on us, you know. The house was truly a hill on a hill. And so that meant that when you went outside to play, you were playing on a slope, no matter which side of the house you were on, except right there at Church Street, directly in front of the house. That was the street. It was a little shotgun house because when you came in the front door, you could see straight through the house. But that's basically my memory of that. One of the, children at that time, you didn't have the free reign that children these days have. And so your life was very contained. And in New Albany, that was sort of it. I know that the Rices lived on the other side, but at that time I didn't really know them. I didn't meet them until school. I formally started school at the age of 6. As I said, I went to school before then because my grandmother and my mother were teachers. And since there was no daycare, you went with whoever could take care of you and keep an eye on you at the time. My father was a mechanic and often worked at home. So he was sometimes in charge of us. And my grandparents died when I was very young. So I had a cousin, Hattie Mowry, who was a surrogate grandparent, and more often she was the person who kept an eye on us. But school was always a part of life. So formally, 6 years old, 1st grade, Mrs. Ford's class was my official entry into school. You went to school in the morning, you were there I think we were there by 8:30 when classes started. I was always early because, of course, my mother had to be there early. And until I was old enough to go alone, we had to be there when she was there. You were always there for classes. And in 1st grade, you looked forward to recess. And that was lunch, and you had a break in the afternoon, and then school was out. School, at the end of the school day for me, since I often rode with my mother, I was there when everybody else left. So you got to know the teachers. And the other thing that you learned was service, because my parents did not believe in idle hands. So if you were there and something needed to be done, you just did it. One of the advantages of that is that you learn very, very many skills, some of which you hate and never use, and some become useful, like designing bulletin boards and making the artwork and the little figures for bulletin boards, grading papers. You learn many things. Cleaning up messes. If there's something needed to be done, you did it. And so there was no task too high or too low.
What did your mother teach at the school?
My mother was a fifth grade teacher for many years. Once integration became a part of the picture, then she became a reading specialist and later went back to teaching elementary. After integration, she taught at Mattie Thompson. She was there for many years. In fact, I think when she retired, she might have retired from there. But now when she retired, she just left the public school system, and then she went to work within the community for some of the community programs. So you didn't really quit working, you just ceased being a regular employee. By the time she really retired from working, she had over 40 years of teaching. She tutored. Service was very much a part of her experience. She believed in adult education, so she worked in GED programs. She worked in programs that serviced individuals with special learning needs. So, and then she did tutoring just for people who wanted to make progress. They weren't a part of any program, but they needed some help. So she was always available. Because of my family and because they always encouraged it, I still have a love of learning. I probably would have stayed a student forever if I had been allowed to. But you know, they tell you you only have this long to complete your degree and then you got to get out. So I finished my degree and got out. But my love of learning is not contained within any particular field. I love learning about all kinds of things. And that has been good for me because there's several things that I learned. Our teachers at BF Ford wanted us to learn. They encouraged learning. They encouraged curiosity. They also encouraged excellence in whatever you were learning. So I can remember being very, very upset because we had a final exam and I knew all the answers and I got a 99 on it. And the answer was correct, but I had misspelled a word. And so my teacher said it wasn't a perfect paper. And she took that point and I was furious. Of course, I learned to spell the word. The word was chariot. I can now spell chariot. But I've never forgotten that. All of them encouraged excellence. You know, you had to learn the correct verb tense. You had to learn where to put the period, the comma, and the semicolon. And those were just things that were deeply ingrained in you. Their feeling was that they were preparing you to compete in a different world. And they told you that repeatedly. They told you you had to work. And so, you know, that was our norm. That was our norm. That was what they did for us. At the same time, they encouraged me in that way. I was in school before special education. And so our classes had all students in them, and they worked with other students just as they worked with us, differently, but still giving them the encouragement, still trying to equip them to be able to do whatever it was that they did. And so, you know, you look across that spectrum, and from that, I gained an attitude that everybody can do, everybody can learn, everybody can do. And so I've carried that with me across the years. But the other thing that I learned is that those people who had accomplished things tried to help other people to accomplish and achieve life goals. And so for me, that translates into mentoring. I mentor doctoral students across the country. I particularly mentor students of color, but any student who has a learning desire, I'm willing to work with. You don't have to be in my area. You know, I'll learn whatever it is you want to learn so that we can move forward. If you're interested in publishing, I'll work with you on your publication, whatever the area it is, because the skills of writing are the same. They transcend disciplines. And so we can help to construct that document so that you have that credit and that achievement of having a publication. You know, but those are things that I learned from the people, you know, who were BF4. Faith, you know, they were forever faithful. And we saw them in and out of school, in church, in the community, and it's socially. And so the faith component was very strong. All of my families went to church. You know, my father's family was Methodist, my mother's family was Baptist, but we went to church. And you came together around that central belief. And everybody, no matter which denomination, no matter what background, was, hey, you have to have faith, you have to pray, you have to be faithful. And your faith was an integral part of you. And so learning from the segregated experience of having few resources, but doing much, and the fact that faith enabled you to take that little and do much has been a central piece for me. It's been very important. I attended church at Shady Grove. When my father went to Shady Grove, I attended church at Pine Bluff, which was my mother's church. And when we moved to New Albany, we joined Watson Grove. Our family farm is in Myrtle, and so we stayed there. My parents wanted a house, and so while they saved for the house, we lived on the farm, and my mother commuted. And so we commuted from Myrtle to New Albany for school, her for work, and that's, you know, so I had the experience. One of the best things about being in Myrtle was that if she or my grandmother were teaching summer school in Myrtle, I could occasionally get the chance to ride the bus. And that was a treat for me. I thought the greatest thing in the world was riding the bus. My children have since disabused me of that notion, but for me, it was great. I got to be with my friends, you know, and go and come. And I think it was also sort of a symbol of independence that you could get on and off the bus by yourself. It's on Standish Street in New Albany. Before Standish Street was really a street, it was a road, and it ended at the top of the hill that used to be there above Shadydale Park. And I can remember in the discussions about Shadydale, my mother being very involved in that and feeling that children needed a park, that it was important to have that recreational outlet for the children and for the community. I don't think that she realized what it would mean in terms of the traffic, but many times at the time, The hill at Shady Dell was probably one of the greater driving challenges in the city, possibly in the county. And so often people would knock at the door because they were stuck or had run off the road and needed to call for help.
That is a steep hill.
Not anymore. It has been reduced where there's a curve now. It used to go straight downhill. So there was almost a 90-degree angle at the top of that hill. Maybe 10 when we moved to that house.
Is that house still standing?
It is. It stands in the same spot. The house, we still own the house. And so, yes, I know the person who lives there. Miss Ford, Miss Bramlett, Miss Hill, Miss Turner, Miss Kennedy, Miss Howard, Miss Gibson, and my ambition when I was in high school was to be a chemist. By that time, the addition to UCTS and its transition to BF Ford had taken place. We had a science lab that had tables and cabinets and nothing in them. And we had a student teacher, John Darden, come, and for our biology class, we got a chance to watch him dissect a frog. He had to bring his own tools and all of that because the lab was just a room. There was nothing there. And we never had lab experience, but I had read the biography of Marie Curie. And so I decided that chemistry was the place for me. Now, without that lab experience, you know, in addition to the knowledge deficit, there was also a lack of understanding about what the life of a chemist was like. And so for a person who likes to talk, I quickly learned that, you probably don't want to work in a chemistry lab. But that was after my second semester at college. But all of our teachers had an impact on me because they all pushed us. I remember Clyde Estes, who was our math teacher, and I would say, but Mr. Estes, why do I have to do it that way? I can do it this way. Don't stop. Don't just do it the way I showed you. And he had showed us, of course, how to use the formula, and the way that I wanted to do it, of course, was not consistent with the formula, even if I came out with the correct answer. But you got to learn to use the formula. So, yeah, even that was helpful. Okay, I'll learn to use the formula. So, all of our teachers, each one was different. Each one encouraged you in a different way, but they were all consistent in the fact that you must learn. You must not just know, but know how to use the information and use it well. And to prepare us for, we didn't really know this at the time, but standardized testing was coming. You had to know how to take those tests, and you had to know how to do it quickly and accurately. You had to have a vocabulary. You had to know the words on there. And the words on the standardized test, they may have been the same words, but they didn't have the same meaning. And I can remember many times, once, we would take the test, I knew words because of reading, but not because the word that they had on the test was the word that we used. And the most common example I can think of is iron. We didn't iron clothes, we pressed clothes. Different meaning, but you had to know both. And so, as I learned later on, we had to learn to code switch. We had to be able to function in our community, in our environment, but we also had to be able to function in society as well. And in our case, it was a society which expected less of you, which demanded more of you than of others. And you had to be able to manage it. And that's what our teachers did for us. They gave us the encouragement, they gave us the skills, not necessarily the end knowledge, but so that you could acquire the end knowledge. And then they told you you could do it. And they didn't accept no, they didn't accept I can't. Those were things you just didn't say. You just got up and did it. My classmates were really important. At third grade, second grade, we did a double promotion. There were about 5 of us who were promoted mid-year. And so you had to catch up with the rest of your higher class. That served a couple of purposes. One, it made me one of the youngest people in my class. My classmates were a year, 2 years, some 3 years ahead, older than I was. So that had probably more social impact than academic impact. But those classmates were caring. They would tease you and you'd get your share of flack, of course, but they also cared. They encouraged us. So it wasn't just at the level of the teachers, but your classmates encouraged you. They held you up, you know. And that was something that was very important as well, because that sharing, when you leave that caring community and you go into the greater world, it's people pulling to themselves and keeping to themselves. And so that sharing that I learned from them, that support that I got from my classmates, I mean, they would tell me in a minute, no, you can't do that. Oh no, you got to do this. You got to do better. It was not a question. It was, you know, this is what you got to do. What, did you do it? That's what they expected. Once we were in high school, Grace Wade and I went to a number of summer enrichment programs. It was always good to have her there, even though we were separated. We were never roommates. We were always in different groups. But it was just good having somebody else there because you knew some similar people. And yet you could go out and make new friendships and could come into different groups. That was always good. I still have some of the friendships that we made during those times. I've been able to keep track of some of those people. But the greater thing is that even now, I'm able to stay in contact with my high school friends, my friends who are home, and they still encourage me. Working fine, working fine. The programs were designed to be challenging, and so they were always challenging, and yet there was reward for meeting the challenge. The first summer we spent at Jackson State, and one of the rewards was you got to tour the state. So you visited, you got to see the school, Jackson State, but we went to Tougaloo, we went to Alcorn, we went to Biloxi, to the Air Force Base. So you got to see things within your state that you may not have been able to see before. The curriculum, we had a class in humanities, for example. You expect the math, the reading, the English, but humanities, oh man, you know, that was great. I had read some of the classics, but to have someone stand who had visited the sites, who brought artifacts to class, who pointed out how the classics are continuously used as a basis for commercials, for example, you know, how those images are perpetuated. That was like, oh, a whole new level. When we went to Knoxville, this program was sponsored by the United Presbyterian Churches. It was even more challenging. They had a curriculum that was designed to prepare you for the college curriculum. You had classes every day, 5 days a week. You had plenty of library time. In addition to that, you had skills training. You learned writing, testing, reading. For example, learning to speed read was one of the things that we learned there. Learning how to take a standardized test. And we were tested on all of the skills regularly. But when you and you had to successfully make it through the summer to be invited back for the next summer. And when you successfully completed the summer, there was always a treat. So for example, the first summer that we were there, we went to Washington, D.C. at the end of our program. And they told us that if we were successful in being invited back, the next year we would go to the World's Fair, which was in New York. And so the next year we went to New York to the World's Fair. And at the end of that was the summer before my senior year. When we graduated, you had all kinds of offers coming in from colleges, all kinds of colleges recruiting you. It was a really amazing process. And I think about our parents who, they're like, they didn't say, you have to stay home and go to this school or that school. They just sort of let you go through the information and you've made some choices. And then they had to talk to the school, of course, to make sure that the school was going to take care of you and know something about it other than what was in the brochures. And I often think about what it took for my family to send me that far away. My first semester there, I went to school at Monmouth College, which is in Northwestern Illinois. My first semester there, I was in the hospital. My cousin, who was the closest person to the campus, was in Peoria, which was about 70 miles away, took me to the hospital, dropped me off, checked on me, and called my mother. My mother then proceeded to call the dean of women. Now, among other things, one of the things they found out, of course, was that I was anemic. I had been anemic my whole life. However, the dean of women decided that I did not eat enough. And so when I first got out of the hospital, I had to report to her weekly so she could check my diet. And then it was like about every month or so, she would call to see how I was doing because she had to call my mother and let my mother know how I was doing. So there was that type of relationship between my mother and the university. The other side that I find, and my classmates there, and I found interesting, was that we had interesting roommates. My freshman year, I was in a suite with 3 other girls, all 3 of whom were white. And down the line, as we're talking, we find out that their parents had been contacted and asked for permission for them to room with us. This was in 1966. My mother hadn't been contacted to see if it was okay. One of my classmates who was Black came. We were talking, you know how girls sit around the dorms and talk. And we were in school at a turbulent time. And so a lot of civil rights issues were front and center in our conversation. And so as we're talking, one of the roommates said, oh yeah, we were talking about an interracial couple. Oh yeah, my grandmother led the group. What group? The group that ran him out of town. Oh, That was the end of that roommate relationship. I had 2 from Illinois and 1 from Missouri. All 2 of them were from small rural towns, and 1 was from a suburb of Chicago. My roommates were all very great. And, we got along very well. We only roomed together that week, but we continued to be, that year, but we continued to be friends. Monmouth was a private four-year institution. It had Presbyterian affiliation with this, but was not a Presbyterian school any longer. And it had a Scottish heritage. So we had bagpipes, but it was probably 99.9% white at the time that I went there. The good news was that it was a small school, and so I did not feel overwhelmed by masses of students around. The classes were pretty congenial. People knew each other, I guess was the basic point. And Monmouth was a small town, and so likewise, you were familiar with people from town as well as from the campus. But the campus, one of the reasons I chose it was because they had a student exchange program with about 20 countries. And at the time, I wanted to go to Paris to study. I wanted to go to the Sorbonne. And that was one of my goals. By the time that I had gotten to a point where being an exchange student might be, I was eligible, my interests had shifted. And so I didn't do that. But it was a truly great experience. We had students from 26 countries there. We had faculty who were likewise nationality diverse. There was no racial and ethnic diversity. And in fact, we probably, during the time I was there, we got our first Black student advisor. You know, Black students recruited other students. So we did increase the enrollment somewhat, but basically it was the same school. But I was in student government and all kinds of social groups. And so I had a lot of opportunities. The chaplain, for example, had a social studies group, informally organized, but it was centered around issues. And so we did field trips. We went to Chicago, we went to Detroit. We studied riot areas. We studied civil unrest. And his goal was to, how do we promote, you know, a peaceful society, a transition to an inclusive society? And so we had those opportunities. And when we went, the group, Black students, white students, international students, many different perspectives. And that was a growing experience. I did 2 semesters of urban studies. One as an intern at an international public relations company, and one as an intern for a Chicago city councilman whose focus was on gangs, and my interest at that time was women in gangs. And so by that time, I had changed from my desire to be a chemist to wanting to do some social service type of role. And I wasn't sure what that was. And I don't think I ever became sure what it was, but my path was directed. And so once I graduated from Monmouth, I was hired back to work in the Dean of Students office as advisor to Black students and as in admissions for recruiting Black students, but also to serve as advisor to the Association of Women Students, for example, and to work with career services. And that was a growing experience. My dean at the time was a licensed psychologist, and he encouraged me to go back to school, to go into graduate school. And so with that encouragement, I started a graduate program, but it really wasn't the one that I wanted. I didn't know what I wanted, but it wasn't that one. But it got me some credits and it helped me in my job. And so I did that for a while. And was later recruited to work for the Illinois State Board of Education as a student advocate. And at that time, I knew that I wanted something that dealt with advocacy and with helping families. And education was an arena in which I felt that there was a lot of need. One of the things I had done as an undergraduate was to tutor at a community center. And so I could see some of the needs for services. But it seemed to me that if at the state level, there was some support for those services, it would make a difference. And so it was a job that involved, I was one of two advocates for the state of Illinois, for public school students specifically, but for all students in the state more generally. And that was a tremendous experience. I learned the value of graduate degrees, particularly if you were a white male. And in fact, I had experiences that were so averse that it's made me set a goal to go on and earn advanced degrees. At the time, I had a master's degree. I had a colleague who had a doctorate degree that I swore he bought. And I remember his name to this day, but I won't tell you what it was. But I said, if he could buy his, I knew I could earn mine. So that went on the list of things to do. But the thing that was interesting was that he got respect because he was doctor. You know, I'm like, you don't know a nickel from a penny, but what your word is almost like gospel. I'm like, I can do that. I know you bought that, but I can earn mine. However, I was deferred, but we made it. At that time, I worked for the state board. My husband joined the military, and we moved to Hawaii. And in Hawaii, I taught part-time, and we lived on Oahu, a mile up in the mountains, and so near the small town of Wahiawa. And so I taught there. And one of the great experiences there was Hawaii has so many diverse cultures. And through the children, you're introduced to so many cultures. And so that was valuable. And it helped me to develop an appreciation for the diverse belief systems that people have. For example, when the time came for parent conference, the principal called us in and he says, now, you have to remember that you're talking to parents who have a strong value of education, but also who feel that if their child isn't performing at the top of the class, that they're bringing shame on the family. And that child can be beaten for that, severely punished. And so you want to be careful how you talk to these parents. And so that resonated with me because many of my students, for them, they were learning English as a second language. They were new to the state and came from many places across the Pacific Basin, and some of them from other countries as well. But how do you tell a parent whose child is just learning the language that this child needs more time to acclimate to the language so that the textbooks make sense to them? How do you tell a parent that in a way that doesn't mislead the parent in terms of the child's progress, but at the same time does not jeopardize the child? So it was a learning experience. When we left Hawaii, we moved to Texas. And so I lived in Texas for the first time at that time and worked for Goodwill Industries. As a the interesting thing about Goodwill Industries was that at that time, they needed a person with an advanced degree because it then made them eligible for certain funding streams. And so that, I think, was one of the things that led them to hire me. But in that role, and I was a work adjustment counselor. And so you help people who have disabilities adapt to working, whether it's learning how to do a particular task with their disability, or whether it was learning to be in an environment where you work consistently and learn work values or work ethic. And so the shop had a wide range of disabilities, of people with disabilities who worked there. And it was a wonderful experience. But one of the things that I learned was the people with disabilities in sheltered workshops were not paid for their work. They had a salary. You might be paid 2 cents an hour. But, that was common for sheltered workshops across the country. And so one of the things that I fought with my boss about was increasing the pay rate for our workers. And of course, this Goodwill is a business as well. And he had to balance the pay plus the income and keeping the place afloat and working, so it was a constant give and take. And I think that if I had not been hired by his boss, he probably would have fired me the first day he came back. But he was on vacation and his boss hired me. So I got to stay and fight for some better equity, not necessarily for equal pay, but more equity than what they were receiving at that point in time. And to work with parents, work with people who had a wide range of disabling conditions, from head injury to cerebral palsy, to epilepsy, to behavioral disorders. And so I learned a great deal there. I got to work with counselors from Texas Rehabilitation Commission. And as we were talking about moving and I was getting ready to leave, they were encouraging me to go into that field. And I don't know, I was shaky, but it did encourage me to look at rehabilitation education as an area of study because I wanted a doctoral program. And so, of course, one of the things you do is you call people in the area you're going and say, hey, I want to go back to school and I want some money to do it. So who's got money? And nobody wants to, well, there are assistantships and fellowships available, but they were very few. And at this point, nobody's really trying to have these in areas I was interested in. But I hit a friend, and when I told her what I was doing, she says, I know somebody you should talk to. And she sent me to one of her friends, and he sent me to another person he knew. And so I ended up with, this was about April, and I wanted to start school in September. And so by that time, most of the money is gone. Programs are through admitting people, and they're not really looking for somebody else to come in. But, I ended up applying, getting an interview, going for the interview, getting an assistantship, and getting admitted. And so my husband was looking for a house while I was doing these things. And so I ended up going to Southern Illinois University. The interesting thing about my doctoral program is that, of course, my focus is mile wide and I want to do lots of things. Well, they allowed me the opportunity to do those things. One of the areas of interest was behavioral medicine. And so I was interested in wellness and health promotion and how all of these things connect to individuals' behavior and how you change behavior so that people have better lives, more productive and satisfying lives. And so as I was able to articulate this, people who had those interests said, oh yeah, come on. And there's a job over there. I need you to go apply for this job. Okay, well, I wasn't planning to apply for that job. And so a month goes by and he says, I thought I told you to go over and apply for that job. Oh, I'm going, really, I'm going. He sent me to what I thought was applying for the job, turned into a job interview, and I got the job. Well, the job was to develop and run a community-based center that served the entire county, all ages, and it was a health promotion, wellness, education, and job, developing educational programs. So I had a GED program, I had a health and wellness program, I did outreach and screening, and ultimately we had one of the higher rates of Black male participation. Our rate was higher than most programs in inner cities. And so we were good. We got a lot of community support. People would come, they would do programs for us. They would tell other people about it. We had intergenerational participation. And so at that point, my children decided they would no longer go anyplace in the community with me because too many people talk to you and you know everybody. And how do you know I was someplace I wasn't supposed to be? So it was really an interesting experience. I worked it for 3.5 years. The other side that was interesting was that friends said to me, oh, you're not going to be able to do that because it involved working within the community. The community was low income. And in fact, I served the entire county, and that included both high income and low income areas, but the center itself was located in a low income area. I said, you're not going to make it. Those people aren't going to work with you. And what I wanted to say, but I didn't, I'm from New Albany, Mississippi. I was trained by the village. The village told me that there was nobody that I couldn't work with. There was nobody too high and there was nobody too low. And so as our program was successful and grew, I just smiled. Every time I would see that friend, I would just smile. But that's what New Albany, Mississippi did. New Albany, Mississippi said, if you don't have resources sitting there waiting for you, don't wait for them. Get up and go out and find them. And that's what we did. I had students come through, I trained students, and my grad assistants understood. We did community outreach and we did it well. But that was because in New Albany, my community was there. The community said, if you give, if you're here, then this is what we're going to do for you. And so that was our approach to outreach at that time as well. I live 200 miles south of Atlanta and 100 miles north of Tallahassee. And I'm in Georgia. I was recruited here. When I finished my doctoral program, I taught at the University of Georgia for about 4.5 years, 5 years. And then I moved to Texas, to the University of North Texas. I left the University of North Texas and went to Florida State. During the time I was at Florida State, my mother became ill, her health was declining. And so we had decided that she needed someone to live with her and to take care of her. And so I was the unattached child. So I moved home, or at least that was my thinking. When I got home, um, I changed her doctor. We changed her medication. My mother recovered from being overly medicated and misdiagnosed. And she decided I was in her way. And when was I going to get a job or something? What was I going to do? About that time, I received a call from Albany State University. They wanted to start a rehabilitation counseling program. And they had been given my name as a person to talk to about starting that program. And so I came to Albany State University in 2002 to start a rehab counseling program. That probably took about 15 years to get kicked off for a number of reasons. But that's how I came to be in Albany. And after I came to Albany, before, we submitted the grant for the rehab program, didn't get funded that year. However, the College of Education had funding for a program with an African country through USAID. And the director of the program was changing. They needed someone to run the program. And I was asked to do that and to work with the country of Namibia. And so I did that program for 2 years, had an opportunity to visit Namibia, and it was wonderful. Came back from there and taught for a year after the program ended and had an opportunity to coordinate our program. And so the rehab program got further back on the line, but at the same time, there were other things happening. One of the things, of course, was that one of my goals was to have a leadership role in the profession of counseling. And so over the years from the time I went to the University of Georgia on, I worked with the counseling professional associations. And so I had presidencies of 2 national professional organizations. I served on the governing council for the American Counseling Association, and I chaired the certification commission for rehabilitation counselors. And so with all of that going on and my full-time teaching job, as well as some of the other service activities, it took a little while, but what we did was we ended up redesigning the existing counseling program so that it now has majors in clinical mental health counseling, rehabilitation counseling, and school counseling. And it offers stipends for people who want to come in with a rehabilitation counseling major. So that program did get underway, and I still teach part-time with the university. And I have a consulting business that I work in, where I work with organizational development and program evaluation. But rehabilitation counseling is a field that trains counselors to work with people across the spectrum of disabilities. So you may find a rehabilitation counselor working in a state vocational rehabilitation agency. You may find a rehabilitation counselor who works in a hospital setting. You may find a rehabilitation counselor running an independent living center, a center like the Association for Retarded Citizens, for example, or the Traumatic Brain Injury Association. It's across the board. Our students have to learn to work across the spectrum of disabilities. Many people associate it with substance abuse. We also train people to work in substance abuse settings. So once you're into a rehabilitation counseling program. Many programs offer the opportunity to specialize in specific areas. I had a very well laid out plan for my life. And at each junction, God slapped me and he said, no. And I said, well, I'm going to go this way anyway. And he would slap me and he would say, no. And those doors closed. He said, now I'm going to open this door over here. And that's where I want you to go. And he opened those doors. And so I have been led more than I intentionally, directionally went in those directions. People often say, well, what is your purpose? You know, I don't know what I'm supposed to do in life. Oh, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to go in that open door. And then once I get in, I'll be told what to do from there. I've been told to listen, be a listener. People need somebody to talk to, listen to them. And that's my goal. That's my role. You know, that's my assigned function. And from that listening, you know, you get your direction. But it is a wonderfully diverse life, and divinely programmed in that way. For example, in my master's program, which is in counseling, I wanted to work with children. However, I worked full time, I traveled, and so I had to have a somewhat flexible internship site, which turned out to be a private mental health center. But that center operated a methadone maintenance program. So before they would let me work with children, I had to spend 3 months working at the methadone maintenance clinic. And I'm like, what's that got to do with children? I still have no connection to how that relates to children. But being at the center meant that I had to learn a different set of skills. I tell my students, you know, when you finish your program, you think that you've learned all there is to know. And you know everything that you need to know to be great. Day one, I walk into the clinic, I'm doing an intake, and this woman is fascinated with her shoes. And she keeps looking at her shoes. The intake took an hour, and it took that hour for me to figure out, oh, it's not the shoes, because I was dying to get out from behind that desk and see her shoes. She was nodding. She was high. She was nodding. It's like, I had read about people who are on heroin who nod, and that was symptomatic of the addiction, but did I know what it looked like? Not until that moment. Not until it was like, oh, okay, so I'm talking to this woman this whole time and believing what she's saying, and she's out of it. Totally out. So you learn, you know, there was learning and there was new knowledge, there was growth at every path. It was great. I look forward to life with zest. I'm enthusiastic. I'm wondering what's next. Being retired has been interesting. People can't figure out why you're still working and you don't have a lot of time because you're working, but you're retired. Yes, being retired, I have learned, means that you no longer have that employer. Now you are your employer. And so you have other options. I'm working with a colleague on a project with Black farmers. And in designing the project, we have included Mississippi. We're operating across 3 states. And so we're negotiating that project now and looking forward to that. But I have a very personal interest in Black farmers because of my history and because of the people I know. And I would love to be able to help us move forward in terms of seeing the growth rather than reduction in the number of Black farmers in this country. The numbers have shrank tremendously, and the amount of land that is held by Black families has decreased tremendously. While we may not be able to do a full about face, being able to help stop that decline would be significant for me. My mom died in, I think it was 2004. My father died in about 1990, 1988. So it's been a long time. My older brother died on Christmas morning about 2005, and my sister died in 2015. I have two biological and a stepchild. And my children, my daughters are both in helping professions. And I look at them, I see my mother, I see my grandmother, whom they did not know, my grandparents. So I see New Albany. I see BF Ford.